Aloha, this is Dan. From 2016 to 2017, I tried my hand at putting out video essays about film topics on YouTube. The production of it was more than I could handle at the time, so I shut it down after only several episodes. But now that I'm getting my podcast up and running again, I've reworked the audio from that show into podcast episodes, which I will publish by the dates that the YouTube episodes were originally published or intended to be published. This one was originally from April 1st, 2017. New content is on the way as well. Hello, welcome back. And there's a topic I really been thinking a lot about, something I really wanted to get off my chest. Because the nature of my night job involves a lot of traveling, where I'm on a bus for a number of hours at a time sometimes. So I've been using that time to catch up on some movies that I've been meaning to get to for years, things that I've had on a list, things that I've always meant to see but just never knew when I'd get to it. And as I think I mentioned before, my favorite genre of movie is action, because I love tension, I love suspense, I love good fight choreography, I love a good shootout, and I love good special effects when they're used to support the action and all the other things that come with a good action movie. I've always kind of gravitated towards action ever since I was a little kid. You know, having been a comic book fan and a superhero fan and all that stuff as a kid, and being into Batman and always liking stories where the good guy, you know, has to face off against the bad guy and take him down and stuff like that. So I had a bunch of action series that I've been meaning to catch up on. Stuff that was related to movies that, or influenced movies that I've always heard about. People have always mentioned them to me. Oh, you love Terminator 2, but you've never seen blah and you've never seen this. You know, those are the movies that influence those. You got to see them. Just like when you're a kid and you're getting into music for the first time, whatever modern music is, and then your dad or older brother or whoever it is tells you, oh, this is just stuff that's derivative of, you know, stuff that I like. Like, you know, when I was getting into metal as a teenager, then everybody's like, well, you're a poser because you haven't listened to Black Sabbath and you haven't listened to Metallica and stuff like that. I found that to be true with film as well. There are people out there that think that you have to know the whole broad history of things to appreciate things that are more modern and current. And I totally understand that to a degree, but I also think that movies can stand on their own and you don't always have to know what came before to appreciate what it is now. And obviously movies, just like music, change context over time. And they have different contexts for different people with different perspectives. As I've been catching up on things that I had never seen for whatever reason, things that I never got to, but things that people told me that I should be watching, or that I've heard chatter about, or that I've heard have influenced things that I like. A couple have really stood out to me in the action genre especially. And I'm going to mostly focus on the Mad Max movies, but I'm also going to talk about the Escape From movies, you know, Escape from New York and Escape from LA. So I've always known the title Mad Max, I've always heard about those movies. I knew that Mel Gibson was in them. I knew they were post-apocalyptic. You know, I had the general idea of what they were, but for some reason I just never actually sat down and watched them. I never rented them as a kid, and I just never caught up with them for whatever reason. But since Fury Road came out and the hype machine has been huge on Mad Max again, I decided to go back and catch up on the first three Mad Max after having seen Fury Road last year. And what I'm about to say is going to be sacrilegious for a lot of people I know. It's not the most popular take on things, but I gotta be perfectly honest and say that the first two Mad Max movies I just didn't like. Even though I didn't find it the most astounding movie or piece of art I've ever seen, I found Beyond Thunderdome to be the superior of the first three movies. I know I'm not the only one that feels this way, but I also get the distinct impression that I'm in a very small minority of people that feel that way. And I'm not a contrarian. I'm not saying that just to be like different or cool or anything, but I'm also not a bandwagon person either, and I'll talk about Fury Road in a minute, but at first I just want to concentrate on the first three. So I did see Fury Road first, and I really enjoyed it. And then I went back and I watched the first three in consecutive order. So the first Mad Max I don't want to say too much about because I'm going to get crucified. But the first two especially, the only word that I can really use to sum my feelings up on them was boredom. For years I've just been hearing about how the first two Mad Max movies are like quintessential action movies, how they are like some of the most influential and unmissable action movies, you know, in the past 50 years or something like that. So even before Fury Road came out, I heard a lot of hype about them, especially Road Warrior. But from what I've heard about the first one too, I feel like people kind of hold the first one up as the same level as Road Warrior. When I actually watched it, I was just kind of blown away by how uninvested I was and how unimpressed I was. And I'm going to stop right here for a second and say that I get it. I understand that these were low budget movies respectively for the time, that George Miller pulled off a lot of things that people thought that he couldn't, especially coming from a medical background. I understand that technically they were a feat, and I totally give them props for that. I mean, it is amazing the kind of stunts and action they were able to pull off with, during a time where there wasn't any CGI and everything had to be in camera. Those sections of the movie were awesome. Though I also want to mention that though I haven't been as exposed to and gravitated towards, grindhouse and exploitation films like the 60s and 70s and 80s, as much as some film buffs have been, I have seen some. I understand the genre or genres. I understand that the budgetary restraints, and I understand the style that they were going for with a lot of these films and what the Mad Max films kind of fit into. I understand that story and character weren't their main priority, and trust me, I heard this over and over and over again when the Tarantino Rodriguez Grindhouse films came out. There was a ton of retrospectives about the whole Grindhouse, and exploitation movements, and I get it that those movies were mostly meant to be filler to save the budget for the big set pieces. I totally get all that, and maybe if I had been, my age when those movies first came out and I got to see them in the theater with other like-minded people, maybe I would have enjoyed them more. I don't know. But as it stands, watching them now, watching them mostly objectively, I did have expectations that they would be a little bit more involved, but I really didn't know what else to expect from them. I just thought that they would be solid action movies at the very least. But to me, they just didn't deliver on that front. I'll be perfectly honest, so even though I really enjoyed, when I saw the Grindhouse movies back to back in the theater, I really enjoyed Planet Terror, but I almost walked out of Death Proof. Not because I thought it was bad or anything, but just because I thought that Tarantino made his point of what he was doing with the genre throwback, of how he structured his movie around mostly frivolous dialogue and then these, awesome, very short car chase and action scenes. But as an audience member, I felt a little bit insulted because I felt like he made his point early on and he just kind of kept going with it and going with it. And I just didn't really feel like it was worth my time or money. What I'd rather have done was just rented it and then fast forwarded to the good parts. I know that makes me sound lazy, but as I've gotten older, I've had less and less patience for movies that essentially I feel in a way are kind of meant to be more of an experiment or a callback or a throwback than they are actually meant to be their own movie that stands on their own and tell their own story, but they're just kind of derivative. As much as I appreciate filmmakers paying homage and artists paying homage to the art that came before that influenced them, that's not how I always enjoy spending my time and money. And, for Tarantino's part, I think that he's definitely proved that he can pay homage in much more exciting and unique ways like he did with, all of his movies really, but Kill Bill is a perfect example. Those movies were fantastic, but they told their own story and they had their own feel and they existed in their own world, and they paid homage while they did something new too. But anyway, back on point. So the first Mad Max movie, I just didn't really know what I was watching. On the story and the editing front, I just found it super confusing and just kind of jarring because on one hand I felt like we were supposed to get this impression that they were in this sort of, dying society. I understand that it wasn't like the apocalypse yet, but it was just things were supposed to be kind of falling apart. But then at the same time you saw people running businesses. There was a scene like in a bar, somebody's playing saxophone on stage, and later that they're in a cabin in the woods, and people are just sort of, it seemed like they more or less they were living life normally, but then there was these marauding gang, motorcyclists. It just felt kind of inconsistent, and I understand a lot of that was because of budget, and that perhaps Miller's vision of the apocalypse and the world that he was building wasn't quite maybe fully realized yet. Again, I'm going to talk more about that when I get to Fury Road. But what I really found confusing though was how the scenes really felt like just sort of a mashup of just kind of scenes of things that I didn't really understand what the point was of them for the most part, and who the main character was. Because we were introduced to Gibson originally, and then he had these sort of side characters, his cop buddies around him, but then we would spend long stretches of the movie where we didn't see Gibson and we were with his friends or we were with the biker gang. And then we come back to Gibson and he would be, involved with his love story, but then he'd be upset with the force and not getting to go out on the street the way he wanted and stuff like that. I didn't find it cohesive. And then in the last 15-20 minutes when the Gibson and the biker gang finally clash and those things come together, that's when I felt like the movie actually started and there was an actual plot and a through line, and then there was actually conflict between an antagonist and a protagonist, and that's where the movie actually happened. And in there, I thought that was more entertaining. But it was also, because it was crammed into the end, it was so rushed. You went through the tension of the chases of Gibson's family, and then their deaths, and then all the revenge all happened, in quick succession. So I never really felt you got a chance to relate to anybody or really understand people's characters, except for maybe Gibson, to a bigger degree than anybody else. Then it all kind of wrapped up. Now I did enjoy the end and when the story kind of finally came to fruition, and and how Gibson finally kind of came into the Mad Max character. Like I thought that was interesting. But on a whole, the movie, I just didn't find it entertaining or really even watchable. Again, I get it that I'm not trying to knock on it. I get it that it was a feat for the time. It's not the movie itself, I think, that bothered me as much as it was all the hype around it and the way that people talk about it being this quintessential action movie where the action in it is actually very minimal, and the perspective that people have on it just sort of gave me a false sense of what it was and what it wasn't. I mean, honestly, like to me, it doesn't hold up to, it doesn't stand up against a movie like Terminator or Die Hard or something that is like just a full throttle action ride. Mad Max felt more like George Miller was kind of feeling things out and getting used to being a director and a writer, and it felt more like a work of a student. So then Road Warrior was the one that really had all the hype around it, was the one that I kept hearing, like, well, if you like James Cameron and you like Die Hard stuff and post-apocalyptic action movies and things like that, Road Warrior is the movie of that. Like that Road Warrior was the quintessential, just white-knuckled, full-throttle action movie. So yeah, so I guess I went into that one with some expectations too, because just how much hype is around this movie for being like this untouchable piece of perfection. And again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be negative, I was just so bored. They kept introducing characters, but then they never fleshed anybody out. For Gibson, for the first third of the movie, he's literally just sitting on a rock watching other people do things. And I get it that he's gathering information and he's figuring out patterns and he's seeing what's supposed to happen, but he's so passive, and literally nothing happens for the first 20-30 minutes. Now during this time I was really impressed with the sets, and I thought that the set design and the set construction was just amazing, how all that stuff was real and it was built to scale, and that they had this huge compound and they had these flamethrowers, all that the visuals were really cool. And I know that they had a larger budget this time than from the first one, but even for, at the time, that was still a pretty small budget from what I understand, and they really pulled off a lot of really, really cool stuff. And you can tell that Miller finally came into his own more in this movie with the direction, because I felt like the shots, the cinematography, and the editing were all just on a much higher, more professional level. But it didn't change the fact that there was so little plot and so little character for the first 2/3 of the movie. I was so uninvested. And then finally, by the time that the climax rolls around, then it does get good and it gets really interesting. But I don't know, I was under the impression that the whole movie was going to be like that, and I guess that's my fault for taking people's word for it that it was going to be this certain kind of movie. It really was just what it is. It was a lower budget, kind of post-apocalyptic exploitation film that was fit the context of the time it was made. So going into Thunderdome, my expectations were really low, especially because this one, the hype around this one was that it was the worst of the three. And everybody says that. Every time I've heard anything about Mad Max, everybody just says ignore Thunderdome, it's the worst, it's horrible, what a misstep, it killed the franchise. All these things, especially watching these fresh and watching them now and not having any background, no nostalgia attached to it. I wanted to like these movies because of how much I love action and how much I love directors of action that have been directly influenced by George Miller. I was really prepared for Thunderdome just to be a huge mess. And one thing I can tell you that I was not in Thunderdome was bored. I still don't think Thunderdome, is a terrific movie. I agree that there were some weird choices made, that it kind of went off the rails in some ways from what was set up originally. Though, if you go back and look at the first two, there are some very odd choices that Miller made in terms of character, not just design. I mean, I get it that he's kind of creating his own version of a post-apocalypse where people have kind of lost their minds and people with leather clad and chains and stuff. It was all kind of meant to portray a mindset of the insanity of these people. But if you go back, the first inkling I got that there was something kind of awry in the original Mad Max was when we first initially meet the biker gang, and the first thing they do after they roll up looking all scary and menacing is they get off their bikes and a couple of them start ballroom dancing in the middle of a street, and they just act really weird and random and nonsensical. And the way they talk to each other is just really, really bizarre. So for people to say Thunderdome was weird and didn't fit in the context of the movies, Tina Turner playing a saxophone, I don't know how that was any different than a girl randomly playing a saxophone in a bar in the first movie. I thought it was kind of silly, and it was laughable, but it was also interesting, you know, and made sense in a way with the pigs and the methane and how that was powering the town and everything. What it really came down to with Thunderdome, the reason that it worked for me just, you know, as a cohesive film was that it felt like a cohesive story from beginning to end, and it had established main characters. You know, it had Gibson and Tina Turner, and it had Master Blaster, which was a really funny play on words. And the way that it was kind of like silly, but like heavy and intense worked for me. That the tone I thought was kind of fit this wacky, bizarre world, and it, you know, it really expressed just the insanity of what everybody was going through, you know, and what it would have been like to live in that kind of environment. But what it also had, a plot, like it started a story at the very beginning of the movie, a story that continued on, that was affected by character choices and things, and that, you know, it had a beginning, middle, and end. But throughout that, it had building tension, it had escalation, you know, of stakes. You know, the fact that Mel Gibson started with a singular purpose, and then to get what he wanted, you know, he had to go through a series of trials, and, you know, those escalated to the point that he got like banished, and then it all kind of came back around full circle, back to the town and everything. And what it also had was character development. Yeah, the first two did have, you know, Gibson was the main one that did have development. I know that in the original one, he, you know, he goes from like a loving husband and father to being like a vengeful, almost insane person. And in the second one, he goes from being like a isolated loner only out for himself to, you know, saving people. But in this one, I thought it was much more clearly defined, you know, his character motivation and his shifts in his character. And if you look at all three movies, they do follow a similar kind of character structure, where you have Gibson being a certain way, and then having, you know, a major event happening to him, and then him kind of shifting his view, at least temporarily, so he can accomplish something new that he wouldn't have done at the beginning. I just feel like every time that Miller did one of these movies, he refined his writing, and he was using a similar structure, kind of like what I mentioned in the last video in Ghostbusters, how these franchises do have a formula, and that formula is part of what makes these franchises what they are. But in this case, I felt like it was the most well-rounded version of Gibson's character going through the change. Just in terms of like a film-going experience, I just found that the most investing one of the three. But this time too, there was development in other characters. You know, Tina Turner had a bit of a turnaround, especially at the end. The Master Blaster character, there was a real emotional attachment to that guy, because at the beginning he was set up as this, you know, this hardened antagonist, but then similar to the Rancor scene in Return of the Jedi, you know, I always felt so bad and empathetic with the poor trainer after Luke kills the Rancor. Similar kind of thing here, you know, Master Blaster, he just loved Master. Similar to that, Master really loved his big sort of extension of himself, just like the Rancor trainer had his Rancor, and this, you know, Master had Blaster, and they worked kind of synergistically together. When he lost him, you know, and I think he says when they're in the Thunderdome, he's just a child, or he has the brain of a child, or something like that. That really got me. That really spoke to me. Like that felt like a true, authentic character moment, more so than there has been in these movies overall. I was really touched by that, and then later when he becomes part of the team, I was like, wow, you know, that they actually kind of built up to this, and they gave him a setup for his change, and he was an interesting character. So then I'm sure what a lot of people didn't like, though I haven't heard it as specifically talked about, because most of the time when I hear people talk about Thunderdome, they just kind of shrug it off in general. But I'm sure people were a little frustrated with the sort of like Lost Boys or like Robin Hood thing going on out with the kids that Gibson comes across. And I get that, you know, sometimes, you know, groups of kids, when you, especially in like a dark, you know, post-apocalyptic action thriller kind of setting, you know, people don't want to see a bunch of kids. But I was fine with it, because that felt like it was developed. Like they had their own little culture, and they had their own aesthetics, and they had their own communication style. And I just felt like it was fleshed out, and it had a purpose. And those kids in particular, we got to know them a little bit, and they actually made like a impact on Gibson's character, as opposed to in Road Warrior. I wasn't as moved by his sudden change to, you know, decide to help those people out, because we never really got to know any of them. There was like the leader, and there was the old wise one, and there was like a woman, but we never really got to know much about them. And by the time that, you know, Gibson started interacting with them, they started killing them off. You know, like when they introduced that there was a woman at one point in Road Warrior that he shares a moment or a look with, or something like that. And I figured, okay, so this is either going to be like a love interest, or just somebody that compels him in some way, or maybe, you know, she's the one that helps him turn around. Then they just like kill her off like 5 minutes later. I just felt like there were a lot of missed opportunities for character development, so that when Gibson finally came around and like did want to help these people, that he had a specific reason why, more than just a general, like, I don't want to be such a jerk to these people, you know, and leave them behind. Again, like, Miller kind of took the seeds from that and then, you know, expanded upon it and fleshed it out more when it came to Thunderdome, because he did give us more with these kids, and he gave us personalities, and he gave us more depth to them and their relationship with Gibson. So yeah, I mean, like Thunderdome, I don't know if I'm going to watch it again anytime soon, but it's definitely, I feel like it's more rewatchable than the other two, just for its entertainment value. Of course, I can go back and watch the other two for the technical aspects, but as I mentioned earlier in my series, those aren't the things that really draw me to movies as much as the story and the characters and the emotional connection and the depth. But on to Fury Road. So I did see Fury Road before I saw the other three, and that probably set up some expectations too, even though I did understand that they were made 30 years or more before Fury Road, and that Fury Road was, in some ways, you know, I'd heard it was kind of a reboot, revamp, whatever, reimagining. You know, and I knew that Miller had a much bigger budget and that he was returning to it from a long time, so it was just a, you know, different context for a movie making experience for him. As I was watching Fury Road, I wasn't as into it as I wanted to be, especially with how much people were telling me that it was like, you know, the most groundbreaking action movie that we've had since I don't know, Terminator or Die Hard or something like that. It was, you know, it was this masterpiece, and I heard that the hype machine on that was bigger than anything that I'd heard about the first three, or the first two, and the first two had a big hype machine around them, you know, for like decades. And I think the reason that I still wasn't as like invested in Fury Road as I was watching it was, again, because of the characters. I felt like Miller has this way of sprinkling in clues, kind of like when I talked about in my Trolls video, where some writers and directors like don't want to spoon feed the audience, but instead they make things so ambiguous that you're just left with a lot of guesswork, and you're kind of unsure if they didn't really know what they were talking about, or if they were they put clues in there, but you're just too dumb to find them. I think that Fury Road was somewhere kind of in between, that they're obviously, if you stop and think about it, a lot of the things in there do make sense, but I do think that Miller does like to just kind of throw things out there and see what sticks, and that maybe in his mind he's developed reasons for things happening. For instance, like why people dress the way they do, you know, why like that gang was running around with like steering wheels and spraying stuff in their face. That stuff doesn't need to be explained, but I didn't really feel like there was really any even subtle clues about like why that was a thing. I felt more like that was just, he was just sort of world building, and kind of like in Trolls, where I was okay with a little bit of randomness and bizarreness, because I felt like that was their way of just establishing what the world was like. And in Fury Road especially, as opposed to like the first ones when they're ballroom dancing and stuff, but they're supposed to be these menacing bad guys, that just felt kind of random. But in Fury Road, I felt like the so-called like random features were more meant to be world-building things, and you had to take them at face value, because they weren't going to be explained, but that was part of what this world was like, and I was okay with that. So I just got on and I buckled in for the ride, and I really did enjoy it, but I never really felt as connected with the characters as I wanted to be, especially Furiosa. I knew Max was always going to be more of a sideline character in a way, because of, I heard so much about Charlize Theron's performance and what she brought to the table and everything, and how, you know, she really kind of outshined Tom Hardy in that particular instance. So I was prepared for that, but I felt like her character was written in a way that she was still very much detached, and I never really felt like we got that moment, except for maybe like the end where she shares that look with Tom Hardy, where I really felt like there was a connection between not just her and another character, but her and the audience. So I wasn't totally like character fulfilled, but it didn't really matter in this case, because after the movie I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I realized later that it really is a masterpiece for what it is. What it was in my mind, and from what I took away from it, was, especially now having seen the first three, was that it was George Miller took everything that he kind of conceptualized and tried to work out with the budgets that he had at the time, that he took all of that and just like perfected it. Which to me is like the exact opposite of what George Lucas did when he said that, when he did like the special editions of the first trilogy of Star Wars, and then he went back into the prequels, where he said that those were the movies he really wanted to make. I feel like it's just so hard to believe that, because every time that he just threw some new CGI monster at the screen, it didn't change anything about the substance of the movie. And then with the prequels, you know, I'm not even going to do videos on those. It's been done to death, but the prequels just didn't have, Star Wars in it. And I'm just like, I just don't get how George Lucas saw those as perfected versions of what he originally set out to do. But Fury Road felt like the zenith of the whole Mad Max world. Like, George finally had the budget and the understanding of his world and his characters, and that he really knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he did it with like extreme perfection. That movie, I do think, is a masterpiece, and I think that movie is everything that Road Warrior was meant to be, but he just didn't have the budget to do. Because obviously Road Warrior, the whole reason that movie existed was for the chase, and I only say that because like the first 2/3 of the movie, like nothing really happens. There's just a little bit of tension between the group in the compound and Gibson and the Marauders, the bad guys or the gang or whatever. But nothing ever really comes to a head, and there's no development of any of that stuff in the first 2/3, and then it really all comes to head and comes to fruition with the last third with the chase. But Fury Road had all of that and so much more, and in it had a world that even if you've never seen the first three, I know a lot of people saw Fury Road that haven't seen the original Mad Max and really like Fury Road, and I think that was because Fury Road, it had its characters that were clearly defined, though maybe not as fleshed out as they could have been. But in this case, I don't think it mattered, because I don't think that's what Miller was going for. I don't think this was meant to be, an emotional drama or anything like that. It's more of a vehicle, pun intended, to have this massive chase that expanded the whole film. That's my thoughts on Mad Max. Please forgive me. I know I probably shouldn't have made this video at all. Like I always say, I have a obsessive compulsion to talk about movies and put my perspective out there, because otherwise it's just rattling around in my head. And sometimes I am just really confused about other people's perspective on certain things, and Mad Max is a perfect example, and so are the Escape From movies. So those are another ones I recently caught up with in the past couple weeks. I watched Escape from New York for the first time and Escape from LA, and Escape from New York especially was one where I've had a few people say to me like, "You've never seen Escape from New York? That's like the action movie ever." Like people were just going on about how incredible that movie is, so I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, it's Kurt Russell, like, how have I not seen this? Oh my gosh. And I've always, when I was growing up and going to Blockbuster, and I remember seeing the Statue of Liberty fallen over cover, which isn't in the movie, is it? Did I miss it? Anyway, that was so iconic. Like, I always remember seeing that cover with the Statue of Liberty, and I mean, the snake with the eye patch, and like, so I was like, okay, I gotta see this, because he's gonna be like a Sarah Connor, or a Ripley, or John McClane or something. He's gonna be like at that level of amazing action heroes, or even Mad Max was what I was thinking he was going to be at that level. So I watched Escape from New York, and again, like, I was bored to tears. I just don't understand what all the hype was about. Again, I understand the context. I know John Carpenter's directing style. Halloween is one of my favorite movies ever, and I love some of his other movies, but I just didn't get what all the hype was about with this, especially the way it's billed as a high octane, I think that's the way I saw it on Amazon, was like high octane action thrill ride. And I thought Carpenter did a good job setting up things like this set design. I love the first few minutes where they explain the world and what's going on, and how New York is this giant prison. Gave me kind of a Judge Dredd vibe in that way. And then they introduced Snake, and he just was like such a bad, and like he just seems so cool and collected and everything, and but then the movie proceeds to just like have absolutely nothing happen for like an hour. I don't know, I was dozing off. I was just like, it was just Kurt Russell wandering around rubble and just kind of ignoring people as they either tried to kill him or get something from him. I didn't get like the tension. I wasn't sure, even with the device in him and everything like that, the ticking clock, I just never felt like he was in really any kind of like huge immediate danger, especially because of the way he acted. He just kind of strolled around and just poked around and looked at things, and there was never any like development. It never felt like any real urgency, except for him just checking the watch device over and over and over again. And just like the Mad Max and other kind of exploitation movies, I get that the way that they built this world, there was just a lot of different randomness in a way, just kind of because you can use the fact that society's broken down and everything is in shambles as a means to just throw like random stuff out there. Everything from the way people are dressed to the way they talk to the things that, like the cab driver and how kind of weird and bizarre he was. But I don't know, I was really just waiting for some like really fun action, and every once in a while there'd be like a little thing that would kind of start, like the scene where he's he's inside like the cafe or bar or diner thing, and people are coming in through the floors. Like, that was kind of getting interesting, and then he just got out, and then it was just kind of over, and then he just went back to kind of, meandering around. I don't know, I just found it kind of unremarkable and uninteresting. And a lot of it was just because every time that he would meet a character, it didn't go anywhere, or they would die, or they would betray him, and then it was over. I get that it was completely unsafe environment, everybody's criminals and everything like that, but there was no, like, I never really felt like any connection with any characters, or that the characters were ever developed or connecting over anything. So it's sort of like the way that, everybody says Thunderdome was the worst, but I liked it the most. I actually liked Escape from LA better, even though obviously it followed the same kind of structure and it had the same kind of flaws to me. But I actually found it a little bit more interesting because part of it, and I don't know if it was meant to be this way or not, it was a bit lighter and more whimsical. Like, I don't know if it was intended to be as silly when he's like in the sub thing and he's going into LA. And like a CGI shark jumps out at him at one point. It just felt like a video game, and it was just kind of funny, and I had to smile and let that, because it was entertaining. It almost felt like Sharknado or something. It just felt more like satire. And then as the movie went on, it had the same kind of problems. It was just him kind of wandering around. But there were times, he did connect with another character at one point, the woman that hides him, and then they go into the place where they're going to take the body parts, and it ends up like he takes her with him, and that whole thing. There was the turnaround too, where he was going to assassinate the president's daughter, but then he doesn't. I felt like there was more character development with him in this case, and that it was building a little bit. So then by the time I got to the climax and he did his turnaround with the military people, I thought that was actually kind of more earned than when he, in the original, when he switches the tape. Yeah, it was kind of like, I wasn't really sure why he did that, because he knew he was going to get, by the time he got out of there, he knew he was going to get what he got anyway. In the second one, they kind of screwed him over more, because they kept lying to him with the holograms, and they were really messing with him, and I felt like it was more deserved and earned the way that he, and it was more like, it had a bigger impact, when he shut down the power for the whole world, as opposed to whatever happened after he switched the tapes in the first one. Even though LA had a lot of like CGI problems and stuff like that, I just found it a little bit more entertaining and easier to get through. But the first one was almost painful for me to get through, because I was just so uninvolved and so bored. Those are my thoughts on a couple of quintessential action series that didn't work for me in the ways that I expected them to. Though in both cases, especially now that Fury Road is out, and seeing what that director's capable of, at this point, I'd love to see that series, the franchise get continued. I'd love to see more fleshed out stuff with Furiosa and Max. And then I'm totally on board. I'd love to see Snake brought back if they ever want to do that. I know they're probably never going to, but I think he's an interesting enough character. He just needs a really good story to give him something to do that isn't just like wandering around and like looking for stuff. And I'd also love to see the world expanded upon, because in both cases, in Escape from New York and LA, he was isolated, in an interesting environment. And this is where I thought like the Raid and Dredd, the more recent Dredd, I thought they really did this right, because they set up a really expansive, interesting world that would be way too big, and it would be too much to try to do in one movie to show you and go through that world and experience it. And also, obviously way too big. They didn't have the budget to do that. So they isolated them in this one space that was representative of the larger world. I thought that was interesting. And the same thing was set up with the Escape movies, where he's stuck in a prison city environment. But then I felt that they never really got to know that environment very well, because you only saw it on this like kind of micro street level, and you just got to meet, just some people roaming around and gangs and stuff like that. I don't know, I never really felt like you really got to know the environment. And like I said, I don't remember ever seeing the Statue of Liberty fallen over. Not that you had to see that, but when I saw that cover, to me that kind of represented a bigger picture of this society being completely, like fallen apart. When he's in there, it just looks like a derelict city. It didn't have that like big imposing feel to me. It felt like he really could have got out whenever he wanted to. Like in Dredd, when they get trapped in that building, it felt really imposing. It felt like they were in a lot of danger. And in both Escape movies, I never felt like Snake was in really all that much danger. So it feels good to get that out of my chest. I would love to hear your take on this, and I'd love to have it explained to me why I should look at these movies differently if I'm missing something. But that's it for now. See you next time.
be sure to visit breathingunderwater.us. Follow me on Instagram at breathingunderwater1 and drop me a line at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. Please note that I do not claim any ownership of any media presented in this podcast, which is only used for promotional purposes unless otherwise noted, and all views and opinions are those of the person expressing them and do not represent any other entities discussed in this podcast.